I'd like to thank you all for attending today's Grand Rounds presentation with Dr. Stephen Hayes, who it is my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce today. So Dr. Hayes is a Nevada Foundation professor in the Behavior Analysis program at the Department of Psychology at the University of Nevada. As an author of 47 books and nearly 675 scientific articles, you heard that right. He's the developer of relational frame theory, which is an account of human higher cognition, and the originator of acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, which is a popular evidence-based form of psychological intervention that's been shown to be helpful in a wide range of mental, behavioral health, and social wellness areas. His popular book, Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life, was featured in Time magazine, among several other major media outlets, and for a time was the best-selling self-help book in the United States. And his new book, A Liberated Mind, has been released to wide acclaim. Dr. Hayes has been president of several scientific societies and has received several national awards, including the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. His TEDx talks and blogs have been viewed or read by over 3 million people. With over 107,000 Google Scholar citations and an H-index of 141, he is among the most cited psychologists in the world. And with that, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Steve Hayes.
Well, thank you for that, David. And I'm pleased to be here with you. I'm really honored by your presence. At my age, doing old man's rants, it's so wonderful to have an audience, I have to tell you. And thank you for coming. I am known for my work on ACT and so forth, and I know many of the people I'm talking to are practicing clinicians and so forth. I have a talk that touches on ACT, but it's a little geekier. I'll try to make it clinically relevant. But one of the sub-themes of what I had to talk to you about today is really that the science is not serving the clinicians for a reason that I think has been largely invisible. So I'm going to just share my screen and let's see if I can, I know from experience, if I don't first put that into presenter view, we'll have a problem. Let's see if I can make it back and share that presenter view and get the right thing. Do you see your activity sign-in slide?
Yes. Yep.
Awesome. And this is part of what's required, as you know, in order to get your, I imagine, CMEs, etc. And so hopefully people know how to do this. And as the usual, this is the part that the institution has to say, but also I just want to say that I don't have any conflicts of interest here. I don't make money on any of this stuff other than the fact I will talk about books, but I'm not going to be pitching anything or talking about anything off label and so on. I titled this Scientific Storm Warnings with the Movement Towards Process-Based Therapy Portends. And really my intention is to tell you about a journey that I've been on over the last several years, especially with my colleague Stefan Hoffman, a very well-known CBT researcher and therapist, Joe Sorochi, a very well-known positive psychology person, and others. And the journey that I've been on is about taking what was implicit in the work on ACT and relational frame theory, although I won't really fully unpack that, and then realizing there was a difficult area we needed to go into. And I'm kind of here like a mariner who faced a storm like that, went through it, and is coming back and saying, no, there's no dragons there. There be dragons, yeah, there's difficulties, but on the other side, there's smooth sailing. And so I want to tell you about what I think is coming. In that story, I hope to explain why I think science has failed practice and what we can do about it. And let's move into where we started when we tried to link up science and practice in a very specific and overt way. And I'm old enough to actually have seen the arc of all this. This is Gordon Paul's famous clinical question: what treatment by whom was most effective for this individual with that specific problem? Under which set of circumstances? And how does it come about? That's the beginning, early days of behavior therapy, which everybody would acknowledge as the beginning of the time. Not that others, I was a Maslow person before I became a behaviorist. So yes, there were people interested in science, but what we call evidence-based therapy, I think clearly starts with the behavior therapy movement. And this was the sort of command instruction. This is what we're up to. If you had to put that into a set as to what it's going to give clinicians, it would give them idiographic functional analyses. On the other side of successfully mounting this, you'd be able to look at the individual in front of you and know what their particular problem circumstances are and how best to move it, because you'd understand how and why they got in this situation, how and why to improve. In other words, you'd know what the processes are. Unfortunately, the processes available at the time were mostly drawn from the animal learning lab, and they were mostly about reinforcement and stimulus control and direct contingencies. And as much good as that can do, and still is relevant to us today, it really didn't touch on emotion, cognition, and sense of self, and so many other dimensions of human experience, because non-human animals simply are not doing what you and I are doing right now. And that needs to be brought into the picture. We've lived through a strategy too about how do we do this. At the time that Gordon Paul was raising that question, there was, beginnings of an attempt to diagnose in the DSM-1 and 2. They were very dedicated to psychoanalytic concepts, sort of knowing that must be the answer. And then finally with DSM-3 saying, no, maybe that's not the answer. Why don't we just focus on signs and symptoms, things you can say and things you can see and things people complain of. We'll put them into empirical clusters. But then we will treat them with medications and psychotherapy in the hope that the medications will become more and more precise as we understand the processes underneath, as will the psychotherapy. Well, the psychotherapy certainly did. This is the Division 12 list. It's kind of APA, the clinical psych one. It's sort of slowed down, I think, because people realize this thing is going to be a mountain. And this list here, no human being can learn all the things there. Of course, the very most important things are at the top of the list. But that's just an accident of the alphabet. I thought of naming it AAA therapy, but it seemed cheesy. It turns out acceptance puts it at the top. But it's silly, really. Nobody could learn all these things. And really what the purpose of it is that we're trying to get to the underlying processes. And we've got along with this level of specification in the area of medications, it's going in the opposite direction. Same medications used for vast numbers of things. Increasingly, there's almost nothing that the SSRIs have been applied to, etc. But the purpose of this was functional. The idea was that eventually we'd figure out etiology course in response to treatment. And when we did that, we'd have a mental disease. Unfortunately, none of the DSM syndromes have turned into mental diseases. And it's not me saying that, it's little APA saying that. The DSM-5 work group said that literally in the word for word. But what we wanted to know, what we think about it again, is etiology is really what are the causal processes initially. Course, the mechanistic development and maintenance over time is what are the processes during the development of the problem, and response to treatment is what are the processes that change it. The real purpose, in other words, was to get to a functional idea. Now, it was cast in terms of a hidden or latent disease because of the tradition. But diseases don't have to be thought of just biologically, of course. Now, this went on for a long time, and it still is going on. You got to fill out those forms and people are dedicated to it, but you really need to know that the funders have lost faith in it. And why? Well, because it didn't lead to disease, because it hasn't led to a reduction in mental health problems. The effect sizes aren't going up. We're not doing a better and better job demonstrably. The clinical utility doesn't seem to be getting easier. It gets more complicated, more and more things on the list that you're supposed to know and feel guilty about if you don't apply. Cost isn't going down, it's going up. And then you hit into something like COVID. You hit these horrible 2 years and you realize that isn't 1 out of 5 those with a diagnosable disorder. It's 5 out of 5. We're all in a situation where we think, we're facing things that stretch our mental and behavioral capacities, and the model doesn't seem to be able to step up to that. Now, this isn't me saying this. We need a new approach. This is the NIMH saying this, for example. I mean, I was there when Jerry Clareman back in the day said, if you don't do a DSM diagnosis, you don't get any funding. When he a person running NIMH after Adama broke up into SAMHSA, NIDA, et cetera. I'm old enough to remember that and met Jerry Clareman, invited him to an ABCT conference as a program chair. Tom Inzel, the director of NIMH, said, no, we're not doing that anymore. We're not going to be funding randomized trials for the DSM. If you don't know that, you need to know that. It was 10 years ago. It still goes on what he called RDoC, the research domain criteria, and his idea is that we're going to focus on these domains of processes, negative and positive behavioral systems, cognitive systems, and so forth. And we're going to do it at all these different levels of analysis, from genes and molecules and cells up to self-report instruments. But really, and he said this in a sentence, really, we know that the reason people have mental and behavioral health problems is because we have problems in brain circuits and neurodevelopment. It's genetic and neurobiological. Well, this is a revisiting of DSM-1 and 2. We don't know that. We absolutely don't know that. And so it was another finger on the scale, but it was also, take away the positive part, a real come back to, okay, if we're trying to get through processes from these syndromes that everybody in here has to deal with and filling out your forms, but it doesn't seem to clather in very good ways. I mean, in the STAR-D trial, a large multi-site study with major depression, there were 3,700 clients with almost 1,100 different combinations of signs and symptoms. That's not a diagnostic system. It's not. And when you look at how many people had a combination of signs and symptoms that were so unusual that only 4 or fewer other people out of 4,000 had the same combination, it was more than half the people in that huge multi-site trial. So we have to do something different. And Inzel said, let's go in this direction, but put the finger on the scale that the answer is ultimately going to be neurodevelopment. These are just ways to get to it. Well, this is what Tom says now. He left that NIMH, went to Google, and now is out on his own private company. When I look back on that, on his 10 years as an RDoC, I realized that while I think I succeeded in getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, I think 20 billion. In fact, I left a zero off that slide, didn't I? I said 2 billion, 20 billion. I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalization, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. I hold myself accountable to that. Well, thank you very much, Tom. I'm glad you hold yourself accountable, but it's not enough. It pisses me off that we could spend $20 billion and we didn't move the needle on the human suffering of the people that we're serving. What's the purpose of all that money? So your personal apology is not enough. We have to do something different. And we have an idea about how to do something different. And the we here are the folks who are developing process-based therapy, which is where I think evidence-based therapy is going more generally. Stefan Hoffman and I rephrase that classical question from Gordon Paul and say, here's your clinical goal. The researchers and the clinicians need to get together to be able to answer this question: what core biopsychosocial processes should be targeted with this client given this goal in this situation, and how can they most efficiently and effectively be changed? In other words, what are the processes that are leading to human suffering? What are the processes that lead to human prosperity, and how can we put them into human lives? Don't be putting people in little 5 out of 9 cubby holes, 4 out of 7s. Find out the actual sequence of things that are happening to people at all levels of analysis, biopsychosocial level. Now, we have a particular idea about how to do that strategically and how to put it into a model. Our idea strategically, and clinicians should wake up because it's pretty cool, is the way I usually explain it is this way. I love mazes. My kids love mazes. I like drawing them. You know, when they were little, they would just, and they all realized, and if you ever played around with mazes, you know how to cheat. Here's how to cheat at mazes. You start at the end and you work backwards. It's a lot easier. All right, let's cheat. Let's start at the end and work backwards. In this 40 years of the $20 billion and more, the $20 billion was the RDoC. You add up all the rest of it, you know, I didn't want to think about how many billions have been poured into the de-SMization of human suffering. Work backwards from the processes that are in those trials that lead to positive outcomes, and then see if we can build a diagnostic system around that. That's our idea. Treatment based on the coherent application of changeable evidence-based processes and evidence-based procedures that ameliorate the problems and promote the prosperity of people. More P's in that sentence than any other sentence ever written. And I got through and said it without stumbling. And these are just a few books. COI warning, I get a tiny little bit of money every time you buy a book of mine. But the newest one is called Learning Process-Based Therapy. I'm really excited by it. I think it's one of the more important books I've ever been involved with my colleague Stefan. Both of these, all of these are with Stefan, who used to be the arch enemy of ACT, by the way, if you don't know the history of that. We argued so much we became best friends and colleagues. That was a really fun story, but I'm not going to tell that now. What we mean by processes of change are just the changeable events that lead to good outcomes. But we need the ones that are theoretically sensible. We can't just sort of throw spaghetti at the wall. We have to have models that are dynamic, meaning they're not just one-headed arrows, they're two-headed arrows. Progressive, some things have to happen before other things can happen. Multi-level, some things that are really important to change have to include or incorporate many other smaller things that need to change. And they need to be contextually bound because you're in the client's context. You can't directly change a thought, feeling, memory, or bodily sensation of a client. You can only change the world they live in, including the talking world you live in psychotherapy, or the biomedical world they live in terms of medication. You have to change the context to change the content. And so we better have processes that start there and don't have a gap, that don't tell you how to get there. So just think of them as empirically established pathways of change. Now, there's lots of reasons that you might want to do this, but clinically, here's one reason that you really should. We know that okay, back up. Here's the most horrifying thing I can say to a practicing clinician, and I say it in the first session to all of my clinical psychology students. Experience doesn't predict competence. Predicts confidence. Get around a clinician who's been doing it for a long time. Boy, are they confident, but they're not more competent. You say, no, that doesn't apply to me. Excuse me? This is one of the most researched areas over and over again. It does apply to all of us. And the only situations in human life where experience doesn't predict increase in skill is ones where you get bad feedback. If I put you in the back of your house and you knew nothing about shooting a basketball, and I say, shoot, 200 times a day. you'd get better. And with no coaching, you might shoot in a really weird way that no coach would say to do, but you'd get the ball through the hoop more often over time. But not if I blindfold you and put earplugs in your and say, shoot 200 or 1,000 times a day with no feedback, you'll be no better later. So what it must mean is we're getting misdirections for our clients. How could that be? Well, let's say my clients love me, they come back. Yeah, they could be completely dependent on you. You probably have people in your clinics who produce dependent relationships with their clients, and you don't want to refer your clients to them. You're not going to say it out loud because you're a polite professional, but you know it. Changes in signs and symptoms don't necessarily predict positive outcomes. You can do that suppressively using harmful kinds of things that blow up on you later on. I can show you ACT trials where we do significantly poorer on signs and symptoms, and then in long-term outcomes do significantly better. It's not, and these things change gradually over time. What are the immediate changes? They are processes of change. The therapeutic relationship, yes. I'll maybe get a chance to explain why. But other kinds of processes, like what? Well, here's the way it's usually looked at. There's problems with this, but in group stats, it's usually looked at treatment changes some kind of process that happens early, and then controlling for treatment, that leads to outcomes. And when you pull that relationship out, the effect of treatment on outcomes gets significantly reduced, called mediation. If you do it properly, it tells you this is a functionally important pathway of change, at least at the group level. And what my colleagues and I have done over the last 2.5 years is you looked at every single randomized trial ever done on any psychological intervention of any kind, on any psychosocial outcome having something to do with mental or behavioral health, that claimed to identify a process of change through mediation and had a treatment as usual, waitlist control. You need those controls because when you compare two active treatments, you can get funny mediational results. Took 2.5 years because we had to look at 56,000 studies twice with reliable things. This is not something you want to do. We call it the Death Star project because it's huge. It's taken forever to build, and we think it's kind of blow up some thinking in the field. It's going to be in behavior research and therapy in 2022. Here's what we're able to do. All of those mediators, and we found nearly 1,000 studies that had good findings that you could rely on, where we could look at the measures, look at the outcomes, et cetera. All of them could be categorized easily in terms of 6 psychological dimensions that had something to do with, and sometimes multiple things, and I'm not saying these are clean dividing lines, something having to do with affect, cognition, attention, sense of self, motivation, or overt behavior. Or they were at other levels of analysis, sociocultural things like, for example, social support or the therapeutic alliance, or biophysiological levels, such as brain circuits or diet and exercise. Here's just some of the top mediators. You don't have to memorize this list. It's actually available in some of these books and so forth. And nothing here would surprise you if you're broadly read. You know, things like affect, acceptance is the biggest dog in the pen, but also anxiety, sensitivity, and self-compassion, attention, mindfulness, the biggest dog in the pen, self, sense of self-efficacy, also the self-regulation, this more kind of spiritual or noticing sense of self, motivation, values, cognition, reappraisal, diffusion, etc. And also mediators from the other levels of analysis. But how can we systematize something that big? We found in those 1,000 studies, there's about 80 of them that have happened at least 3 or 4 times, and about 32 of them that happen with significant regularity. I just showed you most of those. It's still hard to hold all that in your head. You know, maybe we don't just hang on to our diagnostic system because it's simpler. No, it isn't simpler. Those 1,100 different kinds of major depression means it's not simpler when you actually go to apply it to individuals. And this needs to be applied to individuals. How are we going to systematize something that big? Well, our idea that we came to is, how about just using the thing that systematizes everything else in the life sciences? If you go to your cardiologist and you get some sort of finding, blah, 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 and then you say, well, why is the heart like that? And they'll go, blah, 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 blah. And then they say, no, but why is that like that? And they go, blah, blah, blah. And you say, why is that like that? They're going to use the E word. Every line physician, everybody, they're going to eventually use the E word. They're going to say it evolved that way. Not the people I'm talking to. Most of us could go from now to next Tuesday and never use the E word. Why? Evolution is not just about genes. It's about how complex systems develop. That's what it's about. It's about, you have to think in an extended way. And I know most folks don't think of evolution that way yet because of the era we went through, gene-centric analyses. But really, it's about variation and retention of what's selected in context across multiple dimensions and levels. A complex network evolves. If you get on a plane, the reason why you can move the planes around efficiently, they have evolutionary algorithms and big data systems that have the planes move around efficiently. If you go to Amazon and it says, if people bought this, also bought that, they've got evolutionary algorithms doing that. In a creepy way, of course. That's why Google's not safe anymore. And Facebook's, Google doesn't say do no evil anymore because they can't avoid it with what they're letting loose in the world, as we've seen with our politics and the rest. But all of that's been driven by evolutionary models. Well, can't we do something like that? Sure, we could. So you take those dimensions of psychology, of the mediators, the processes of change, these levels where processes can change, and then think about them in terms of variation, selection, retention, and context, but think also in terms of whether or not they're helpful or hurtful. Now, if that sounds weird to you, let me just say that the way a clinician would say. Variation means change. Everybody knows if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you've always got. It's not just Mom's Mabley saying that. If a client comes in basically saying, I want to try what I've been trying for 10 years, and I know you're an expert at making it work now, part of you is going like, no, it's not going to work. You got to do something different. So variation just means healthy difference. Selection just means what works. Look closely at your client's life. They have strengths. They have times. Things have happened. They know stuff. I have a study we just sent out. I wasn't going to talk about this, but I had a study I just sent out last week where I asked just a whole bunch of people around the world, show me with your body, you pick an issue that it was really hard for you psychologically. Now show me with your body, you at your worst. Show me with your body, you at your best. Almost universally, this is people at their worst. Some variant of it. Is it? Eyes closed, head comes down, buckle at the center, arms and hands come in. What is that a metaphor? Closed, not aware, not actively engaged. You want to pick the good mediators? Go back to that mediational thing. Emotional acceptance, why is it in there? Emotional openness, cognitive reappraisal, cognitive diffusion, why is it in there? Cognitive flexibility, values, why is it in there? Doing what works. Mindfulness, why is it in there? Being able to see. This is a metaphor for the exact opposite. And when you ask them at their best, they stand up, open their eyes, put their arms and hands out. So your client already knows what those 1,000 studies show. They just don't deploy it. They don't deploy it because this organ between their ears is telling them no instead of yes, saying, I only want to feel good stuff. Well, if you were abused as a child, you're not going to feel just good stuff. You're going to have to learn how to deal with that. So this is just a metaphor of Waddington's epigenetic landscape for really what we're doing in therapy. We're trying to alter if a ball was rolling down the hill and that's the human life we're dealing with, we're trying to alter the probabilities of a healthy life course. And it's not a simple push, pull, click, click, dominoes falling things. We're altering processes of change. And what psychopathology is, I think, is just things that restrict healthy variation, selection, retention, or sensitivity to the context. That's what it is. And that tells us a little more about what we got to do in therapy. We're going to have to figure out how to be more versatile. It's a distorted little acronym to promote variation and retention of what's successful in context at the right dimension and level. Get healthy variation happening. Notice the winners and losers. Figure out how to retain them. Make sure you deploy it at moments where it really fits. And to think about this across all the multiple dimensions. You can't just focus on overt behavior. You have to look cognitively, effectively, a sense of self. You can't just focus on psychology. You got to be thinking about diet, sleep, and exercise. You got to be thinking about a multi-level system. So how would that work in this new book? COI warning, I make more money on books. This is an actual case. A person with abuse history feels though, parents aren't there for them. The arrows show over time what we think might be a link. I'm going to show you how we get out of the what we think part of it. But this person has big, strong emotional reactions to things and actually do things like yelling, fighting, cutting, doing drugs, which then life starts getting out of control. I feel as though nobody cares about it, and you can't trust people. Coming with an abuse history and with parents who haven't been there for you, that would make sense that you would feel as though people can't be trusted. But then your friends with all of this begin to feel you're too much to handle. They begin to pull away, which actually even feeds that sense of mistrust even more. Life feels even more out of control. And meanwhile, you're not even sure why you're doing. Why this person is going to college and starts missing classes and so forth, and then feeling overwhelmed. Now, if we were to take, for example, the ACT model, you can take this extended evolutionary meta model, which is just our way of thinking about processes of change in an extended evolutionary way. And you can easily, if you know anything about ACT, plug the 6 psychological flexibility processes. I'm not talking about ACT here, so I'll blast through them. Our classic ACT talks about the importance of emotional openness in the form of accepting or receiving the gift that's offered by emotion, not tolerance, not resignation, but being open to learning from feelings. Diffusion, backing up enough that you can see your thoughts, just like Tim Beck had distancing in there. That's the kind of a diffusion concept. Flexible attention to the now. Don't disappear into rumination and worry. Come back into the present moment. Self as context is our weird word for this more spiritual sense of self, this witnessing, noticing, pure awareness sense of self that isn't bound up by the stories you tell, but is there from the very beginning when you open your eyes as a neonate and see loving eyes in front of you from your parents and dump endorphins in your brain, that we belong and connect together in consciousness. Chosen values, what are the qualities you want to put into your life? Ability to create habits. Those are the 6 ACT ones put into the EAM. If you're doing classic CBT, or if you're doing logotherapy, or if you're doing modern psychoanalytic work, all the mentalization, etc., you can fill out most of these rows. If there's rows that are missing, worry about it, because they're not missing from your client's life. I won't have time to unpack the selection part, but I have written a book on it called A Liberated Mind, where I walk out the link between these processes, including the ACT processes, and the very large literature on human needs, yearnings, which are really selection criteria. When you yearn or need something, that's part of the outcome, the proximal outcome that you want. And 850 randomized trials and about 5,000-6,000 studies later, and being deployed now in 18 languages by the World Health Organizations and on the NICE guidelines, and the CDC is inviting the developer of apps to talk about what's going on with smoking and on and on. ACT has done pretty well, thank you, over the last 40 years. And other models are out there. So you can adopt whatever model you wish, but you need to simplify these transdiagnostic processes and begin to think in process-based therapy in this way. So if you go back to that client we just talked about, you see a little spin like here, and I define psychopathology as essentially evolutionary processes gone awry. Well, you can see that if I have a strong emotional reaction to things, which I come by honestly, some of it may be a genetic loading, plus I have an abuse history. I'm going to have emotional reactions very likely. And then there's this piece of I'm going to downregulate those emotions by engaging in behaviors which lead to my life feeling out of control, which produces even more emotional reactions. That, if you look at the headings and the arrows, that's a self-amplifying little evolutionary loop. That's a pathological adaptive peak. But there's another one here, this double-headed arrow. No one cares about me, but then you do things that push friends away, and then it feels nobody cares about you, and you do things that push people away, and that's self-amplifying. That's around this schema, you might say, really, but fusion with a cognitive idea and not having chosen meaning, but just sort of stumbling through what you're doing and then not even clear what school's for. And that's becomes self-amplifying. But then as that gets messed up, you start having more emotional reactions to things. This is what process-based therapy is about, is thinking about human beings in this kind of complex network way that is individually focused. Now, would this improve outcomes to do it this way? Well, I think ACT is a pretty good test case. It looks like it, but put that aside. I mean, one of the ways it would look like it is the same processes, those flexibility processes in those 850 randomized trials. Well, actually 861 as of this morning. We get a new one every 2 days. A lot of mediational evidence, and we know whether you're dealing with athletes or training for the Olympics or people running a business or couples and families or diet or exercise or depression and OCD, you know that these processes are relevant. So that's kind of a test. But also, when you give clinicians the freedom, instead of here's a one-size-fits-all protocol, it's 400 pages, give that to your client, but instead say, take the elements of these evidence-based packages that are themselves evidence-based that can target the specific needs of your client. Just that, Boo Chapita's work in Hawaii shows, gives you better outcomes. If you tailor, like in apps and websites and things like that, where you can do it actively, or you train clinicians how to tailor, to be able to fit these kinds of skills to the actual situations the person is in, you get better outcomes. If you do process-based tailoring in the domains in which it's been applied, you get better outcomes. I can refer you to the studies. PBT is going there big time. Somebody's got their mic on. Or left the door because I bored them. I don't know why it goes. All right, but if you do this, if you decide that the red pill is that you want to eat, not the blue pill, and like in the Matrix, you need to be warned. And that's why the title of the talk. And here, this is kind of geeky. It's more science story, but I'll blast through it and land in a clinical way. Here's something you all know as researchers, and you should know as clinicians, but you may not realize how fundamentally important it is, which is our statistical approaches that we're using now. Classical stats tend to homogenize people. They treat them as norms and as means and standard deviations. They're error terms to the central tendencies by which we draw conclusions. And when processes of change are the issue, that fact of homogenation screams so loudly, you begin to say, can we do it this way? And I'm here to say the answer is no, you can't. This is take a normal RCT. This is an actual one. Add high density longitudinal measures. In this case, we'll just do it on outcome. And this is what happens. This is a study by Echabod. This is the BDI, depression scores, comparing CBT to interpersonal therapy. These are sessions, the usual kind of things that you would see in a randomized trial. Okay, but you got relatively high density outcomes there. What do the individuals look like? That's what they look like. So what? Well, here's a big freaking so what. If you're just interested in long-term outcomes, you can say, okay, here's where they ended up. But if you're interested in processes of change, every one of these pathways has to be taken seriously. And how are you going to go from that spaghetti to something where you can reach conclusions? We're in a situation would be just exactly like this. You're in front of a big building. You have to get to the other side. You go in the front door, and the front door behind that little spinning one there is locked, but there is a doorway that goes down into the basement. There's a doorway that goes up into the roof. Or you can leave the vestibule and go out and around the street to the right, or out and around the street to the left, but you cannot go straight through the door. And then you look at the outcomes, and instead of really caring about the process, you just take that little tip at the end. And here's what you'll conclude. What you need to do to get the other side of the building is run through the front door. You can't run through the front door. It's locked. These pathways of change can't be handled with means and standard deviations. Oh, yes, they can. No, they can't. Let me walk you through why. Unfortunately, even our mediational studies have this kind of assumption built into it. Therapeutic changes will be one or two variables, and they form a linear unidirectional relationship. If you go back to classical mediational analysis, you see the heads on the arrows. There's only one head on there, not two heads. There's one head. And you can only do one or maybe two or maybe three, and then you're exhausted. The technology will not allow you to do. You think your clients are responding to one, two, or three things that you're doing with them? There are one, two, or three things important happening in their life. Do you really think that's why it looks like spaghetti? One, two, or three things? Are you kidding me? Of course, that's not what's going on. But it's not modeled. It can't be modeled. You start talking to the person, even in that trial where you concluded, oh, let's say a person had a breakup and then they had low mood and it was mediated by rumination because they're worried about the, okay, fine, that's all good. And now you got a client in front of you. And it turns out that the breakup also led to this profound sense of loneliness, and that fed into remote mood and low self-esteem. There's something really wrong with me. And when you got into that space, you felt even more lonely and alienated and alone, and your mood was even worse. But when the mood went down, you felt even worse about yourself and more lonely and alienated. And those relationships were far more important. You're not going to say, even if you knew that this is something that happened within the group, I don't care about that with this person. You're going to say, what are we going to do about that sense of loneliness? And what are we going to do about that sense that deep down there's something wrong with you and nobody's going to want to be with you ever? You're not lovable. It isn't just the rumination. That's feeding rumination. It's part of it. But it's not just one person. Yeah, one person would look like that. But then when you start going into the others, they all have their little reasons for that spaghetti. Clinicians know this. Every clinician I'm talking to knows this. Who doesn't know it? The scientists don't know it. Or if they know it, they've thrown it overboard and said, no, I'm not going to look. No, no, no. And here's a dirty history. Don't get me doing this rant because I'm so mad about it as I've gotten into it. But we've bought into this idea that what happens to groups of people probabilistically applies to individuals in the group. We know it's not true. I'll give you the classic example of the Simpson's paradox, it's called, where you can see that small groups or individuals not doing what big groups do. Take this, number of errors made in typing and how fast you can type. If I got everybody who's listening to me right now, I'd be able to have you all type, and the fastest typists would make fewer errors per word. Anybody doubt it? The hunt and peck typists are going to make lots of errors. you're going to see a distribution like this. Every single individual, without exception, makes more errors when they try to type faster. You see the problem? You're a clinician. Every single client can show you processes that the group doesn't show. Can even show the opposite. You say, no, that's not possible. Excuse me, it is possible. Not only possible, if you look at Simpson's paradox, there's now tests for it. It happens in a significant portion of our trials. And when you go idiographic, it is a horror story. Why don't we know this? Well, of course, we've known this from the beginning, but here's what happened. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit of the dirty history. I'm going to tell you the dirty history of stats just a little bit, just enough to get you mad, because I'm pissed off mad about it as I realized how we've been had. The assumption in most of our classical stats is between persons variability will predict within person variability. In other words, the behavior of the collective, the means and standard deviations will tell you something about the longitudinal projections, good, bad, or indifferent, of the individuals you're working with. That's the assumption. Now, they knew that it might not be right. All the way back in factor analysis, you can factor analyze across a bunch of people at a given point in time, or within people one at a time. P-factor analysis, they called it. Hardly ever used. Who came up with all this stuff? Well, the guy who started it was Sir Francis Galton, who invented the standard deviation. He invented it. Now, I don't even have it in my talk, but here's the dirty history. I'm going to tell you, ask you a question. He became the father of classical statistics. He's the one who trained Carl Pearson, who trained Sir Ronald Fisher, Fisher's Z, Pearson's R, Frank Yates. Who are these folks? What were they professors of? Anybody know? Eugenics. Individual differences, which is what he created, the psychology of individual differences, was not about individuals, it was about differences. Why? Because he had the belief that the upper classes of the UK were de-evolving because they weren't breeding enough. Do you know that every state in the Union had laws that permitted exceptional people from being allowed to have children? Every state in the Union sterilized people or had laws that allowed it. If you're schizophrenic or your IQ is 80. Think about it. And the stats were developed to do that. I removed it because I didn't think I'd do this rant because I got some other things to talk about. But I actually removed the picture of Sir Ronald Fisher wearing a Confederate flag at a white supremacist meeting in South Carolina, standing next to Frank Yates. When you do a Yates correction on a chi-square or Fisher's Z, you're living out the eugenic dreams of folks who wanted to sort people into the ones that would be allowed to have children. And when you do the DSM, you're not meaning to do it, but that's what you're doing. You're sorting people into the exceptionals. For what purpose? It's not to empower finding out how their lives change. Now, here's where I get mad in an additional way. The stats on which that's based, perfectly fine statistically and mathematically, it's a wonderful invention that works at its right level of analysis. The polynomial distribution works really well, what gives you, normal distributions. But not too long after, Galton came up with it, statistical physics came up with a different idea. They needed to figure out how to model things like molecules of gas, but they couldn't measure it, but they could measure the behavior of a volume of gas. And they came up with a thing called the ergodic theorem. And here's basically what it says in a way that links to what we're doing. It says many, many things, but it was proven by Birkhoff and von Neumann in the early 30s in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Two very, very famous mathematicians. So this is accepted science for 90 years in the physical sciences. And what they needed to do is basically they could put like sensors into a volume of gas and look at a particular space, what's happening, let's say. And they could put it at different places in a volume of gas and look at it. And they could see, well, if you put it here or here or here, what would happen? And they could assume that if it's all kind of happening in the whole volume in a similar way, it's going to be similar means and standard deviations and so forth on these sensors put in different places. And they asked the question, essentially, his first book, Boltzmann, was on molecules of gas and studying that in classical statistical physics. How do we know whether or not the same sensor would show this, what it would show over time? And they developed a thing called the RDoC theorem that says there are conditions under which you can take these different spatial samples and predict what happens over time at in any given one location. It's called the RDoC theorem. So what? Well, what it says is you will get that. You can predict time and space if the processes are stationary, meaning that they don't develop over time. They have the same mean and standard deviation. The behavior of the molecule of gas is going to be the same over time. And the elements are all homogeneous. They follow the same statistical model. And then along comes a guy named Peter Molinar 16 years ago. And I think he has it right. And I've talked to so many statisticians over the last 3 years since I found this out, who realized that space you could think of as like a location, like a person, and time you could think of like psychological processes. And so you say, when will our big means and standard deviations, our science of individual difference, predict the trajectories of the people you actually are treating? And here's the answer: when the phenomena we're looking at are ergodic. What does that mean? They're stationary, they don't develop, and all the individuals follow the same dynamic model. Otherwise, you can't go from the collective to the individual. It's accepted science and physical science for almost 100 years. Developed almost at the same time that Galton came up with his racist tools, because he developed the standard deviation for racist purposes. I didn't think I was going to do this. A direct quote, 1869. To conclude, the range of mental powers, I will not say the highest Caucasian and the lowest savage, but just between the greatest and the least of intellectual intellects, is enormous. There's a continuity of natural ability reaching from the heights to the lowest depths. And the method I will employ for discovering all this is an application to the various curious theoretical law I've derived called deviation from an average. The standard deviation was developed after Galton, who's the grandson of Erasmus Darwin, read Charles Darwin and the chapter on artificial selection, and concluded that he had to figure out how to breed the upper classes. I will not say those savages instead of the Caucasians. No, because I will not say it. He just did say it. We're still fulfilling his eugenic dreams. And enough is enough. So you say, no, this can't be right because look, let me finish the thing. All the individual processes have to be stationary. That means processes of change cannot be studied in group designs. That means the individual human development can't be studied that way. And do you think all the individuals you're dealing with respond in the exact same way to the same processes? None of you assume that. In other words, none of you think human beings are ergodic, and they're not. The noble gases are, but we're not noble gases. And so our stats are built on sand. They have assumptions. Now, if you think, oh, wait a minute, I'm talking to researchers now, this can't be right because no, our stats don't make that assumption. Yes, they do. When you are applying the normal distribution, for example, if you just were dropping, and I'm going to put most of the black balls on the left and the white balls on the right for obvious reasons, I'm going to apply it to this racist purpose. And you fall them down, Galton's quincunx, I think they called it, bean machine, Galton's board, and they fall into that normal distribution. You saw that in stats class, and it all looks good, right? And it all fits the normal distribution. And yes, if they started out a little bit different at the beginning, like black and white, a little bit different, there'll be a little difference there, but then you'll have people like out of my tradition and the book, The Bell Curve, arguing that the differences are so large, they can't be due to, anyway, the black and white distributions have to be due to something genetic, etc. If you do something different, if instead of doing balls that are big enough, you do balls that are little, and again, have most of the ones over here white, most of the ones over here black, I'll give you the next thing, and you can already see what's happening. It's not headed towards a normal distribution. Why? Because small balls have momentum when they hit the little top of the pin. And so the probability of the next pin is different. Does that make sense to you? Of course they knew that. But wait a minute, if you were abused as a child, are you telling me that the next probability is still 50-50? I have an African-American daughter. When she was 2.5, we were thrown out of public pools in the South. She was conscious enough to know what was going to happen. She heard that woman say, "Your baby looks too brown." You think that has nothing to do with the course of her life? Now she's 52. You think the probabilities are the same? Of course they're not the same. How is it modeled by what we're doing? It's not. It's right there. The reason why this ends up like that is that you have to model it developmentally. Classical stats doesn't do that. It's normative, and it makes unrealistic assumptions that violate the ergodic theorem. It is based on it. So this spaghetti problem, you can't go to the end. You have to look at the trajectories. If we want to have a science that applies to individuals, we have to go there. Now I'm going to show you some positive things. That's the stormy sea, because man, that applies to so many things. But here's what we're going to do. Take high density longitudinal measures of our clients' lives, including the processes of change that we know or think might matter. And even though some of those came from, well, they came largely from group design, some of them came from smaller end studies, and we have to start somewhere. And then identify the patterns within the person over time that predict success or failure and model that. And then look to see, are there other individuals who kind of show the same patterns? And if, and only if, putting those people into the same class allows you to see the individual even more clearly. If they do, you can include the subgroup or the overall group. If they don't, you throw it out. There's not even a name for this. Do you know the word normal wasn't in the English language until the Civil War? Barely. We're 150 years into eugenic dreams based on normality, and we don't even have a word for what would happen if we treated individuals first, nomothetic generalization second, only if they help us understand the individuals. We had to make up a word. Stefan and I made up idionomic. But those statistics now exist, and I'm going to show you what we've done. We've taken this EAM, this process-based way of thinking about integrating processes of change, and we've come up with items that are focused not on any one theoretical model. They're very common sense items. We want things that anybody can use, and deliberately not using fancy words. I acted in ways that helped my health. I did things to connect with people who are important to me. We tried to focus on things people do that fit with these various processes of affect, cognition, attention, sense of self-motivation, etc., and some variation retention items. And we asked people repeatedly to give us a rating of those, at least twice a day for 30 days. And we fit them through a model where each individual is modeled first. How do these processes and outcomes, which I'll describe in a second, link together using something called SGIME, group iterative multimodal estimation. Peter Molinar, the guy in 2004, one of his students together, Katie Gates at Chapel Hill and Peter Molinar came up with this method, where you do dynamical networks within the person that are fitted then to subgroups if and only if they improve the idiographic fit for most of the people. So essentially the group is the error term, not the individuals. We put classical stats on its head. And then we put the outcomes in. We're using a single item measures from the STAR-D trial for sadness, anxiety, anger, stress, and lack of social support. We added burnout and life satisfaction. I'm going to show you, this is an actual human being. This is 1 month of a human being who struggles with sadness and is distressed over it. Solid arrows mean that it's a positive relationship. Arrows with an empty head mean that it's a negative relationship. Bigger headed arrows, it's a stronger relationship. For this person, when they felt sad, they were less likely to reach out to others. They were less likely to do things that connected them to others. And when they did, and when they failed to connect, they felt as though life had no meaningful challenge for them. And when they felt as though life had no meaningful challenge for them, they struggled to connect with the present moment. And when they struggled to connect with the present moment, they felt sad. They also felt dotted means that it had an additional lagged relationship over time. So I won't get the stats of it, but maybe even more important, they felt stuck and unable to change. Doing what was personally important to them did reduce that sense of being stuck. But now look at this and you'd say, this is a self-amplifying loop. This is an evolutionary process gone awry. I feel sad, I withdraw. I don't feel as though there's anything important going on. I space out and I feel sad, and then I withdraw. I don't think there's important going on. I space out and I feel sad. Meanwhile, I'm feeling stuck. I'm stuck. I'm stuck. I'm stuck. And this thing that would help, and actually helps you not feel stuck, what's personally important to you, is not connected to your moments of challenges. I'm guessing these challenges are woulda, shoulda, coulda, or shoulds, or musts, or have tos. They're not deeply out of me. You with me on this? I think you looked at that, you might think of, let's do mindfulness training. Let's help when you're sad, reach out to people. Let's do relationship work. Let's connect your values to the challenges you have. Let's work on intrinsic motivation. Wouldn't you do that? Do you need a one-size-fits-all CBT or ACT protocol to do that? No, you don't. You need to understand the processes for this person, which might be different than this person, who also struggles to connect with the moment and feels anxious, this person with high anxiety issues, and feels like there's no meaningful challenge, but also then yearns for an out or has no appropriate outlet for emotion. And then they struggle more. You got a self-amplifying loop here. Again, personal challenges are not, well, okay, so self-amplifying loop, reading directly to anxiety, or because there's no out for emotions, then not being able to experience a more wider range, which would inhibit anxiety if you were able to do it. I won't have time to unpick this one. Let me give you one that's kind of interesting because it's positive processes, and then I'm going to land this plane in the next 2 minutes, and we'll have 8 minutes for questions. Thinking helped me live better. I pay attention to important things. I stick to strategies that seem to work. They're all solid heads. They just self-amplify. This is a person who's very low in life satisfaction, and the more they do that, the less they feel less satisfied in life. I think this is a workaholic. And why do I think that? Because paying attention to important things is negatively related to doing things that are personally important. Put it in scare quotes, important things. You don't feel it's personally important. That's that empty-headed arrow. And meanwhile, there's no appropriate outlet for emotion as you struggle to keep doing something that works. All right, so here's my 2-minute landing. I did my rant on racist reasons for why we use these. And then I cut myself out of the lengthier time I need on this, but I'll just do it. The storm ahead is that normative diagnostic approach is doomed to failure. I'm sorry, it can never work mathematically. It's impossible. It won't give you what you need to work with individuals. It just won't ever, because it violates the ergodic theorem. Our measures and testing models need to be different. Much of psychometrics violates the ergodic theorem. Our randomized trials are way too less interested in the individuals and the actual processes of change. And we need to add those measures and use appropriate stats that allow us to see how they work, individual by individual. But yes, getting to know with generalizations only if the individual is even more precisely seen. I think process-based therapy gives us a way forward. We have the linklings now in this first study with this PBAT, the process-based assessment tool, that new forms of functional analysis can emerge that are limited in scope to processes we know how to change, but give us person by person answers inside a multidimensional, multi-level evolutionary model that tells us what are the kernels of treatment that be most likely to help. The stats are there, they can be used now. This extended evolutionary model seems to be working well. And so I am here to say that the storms, I believe, will pass, and we have a positive future ahead of us, but only if we go to where the clinicians already are. The person in front of you is what matters. And the scientists need to help you see that person and not treat them as an error term. And that's going to be hard. It's going to be a big shift in all of our various kinds of empirical things we do. But at least then the scientists will be serving the clinicians and giving them the tools that they actually need. So I will stop there and take what little time we have in terms of questions. I'm sorry for going off, but maybe you can see a little bit of my passion for it having to do with Galton's eugenic dreams. We've been had by that.
That's great, Dr. Hayes. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. What I would ask for people to do is put your questions in the chat box, and I will read them off. I have one that was emailed to me here from John Santopietro, who says, I love so many aspects of the talk, including the punch and authenticity. Particularly love experience doesn't predict competence and what it calls to mind about our clinicians as the bedrock in our quest to relieve suffering. A question from the perspective of a leader. Do you have thoughts about how our systems get in the way of the skills / talents / competencies of clinicians? Assuming you agree systems do get in the way, do you have recommendations? What distinguishes the one who get it most right, least wrong?
Well, I think we've been managing care in the form of managing cost instead of care. But in fairness, I don't think we really had the tools to do it. And I think systems have changed when they see, as we get more person-specific and idiographic, what we're able to do. And as we realize that if you empower clinicians to be able to take treatment kernels that are evidence-based and target processes that are evidence-based, you get better outcomes. I don't think I'm fully yet ready to shout that from the rooftops, because there's some important randomized trials that need to be done right on that. There are some good indications in a few early randomized trials. Then the job of systems of care needs to be to empower clinicians to be able to take these kind of measures. You see it in things like feedback-informed therapy, or some of the things that clinicians themselves are doing with higher density measures. And so I don't think we should think of it just as empowering clinicians as allowing just clinical intuition to roll, because that simply is not a good guide either. We need to be able to have the analytic tools to help good clinical decision making. And I think if we abandon our normative eugenic dreams and go to an idionomic strategy, which is in our traditions, that it's in developmental psych, it's in behavior analysis, behavior therapy, it's there, and it's in the consulting room. When you get in there, you're focused on that person. And you're not being given the tools you need, not by the scientists, I believe, in the form that you need them. So one of the things that we're going to do, we actually have an app. There's no COI warning because it's going to be free. We have a preliminary app. That's how we use that study. And we hope to have that available for beta use, not just by anybody, but in Q1 of 2022. The we is a private nonprofit called the Institute for Better Health that I'm president of, 45-year-old outfit. But what I hope to be able to do is take things like the PBAT and give tools to people where they can themselves do it and use it to inform their treatment, and then be able to give that to systems of care. Because when you look at the networks of persons who are going to succeed, the processes have to change. If you go in there with an evidence-based therapy and people come out more emotionally avoidant than they did when at the beginning, that is going to blow up on you. And we know that. We've seen the study, it happened in studies. You've got to get the processes right. Can I say, I know it's taken time, but it's important. Some of you really, I think most of you believe the therapeutic alliance is really important. And here's what we found. If you put the processes of change measures in with the therapeutic alliance, what happens is the therapeutic alliance models positive processes of change, and it actually no longer functions as a mediator. Let me explain what I mean. A good relationship is accepting, non-judgmental, conscious in the moment. The client's values matter to you as a clinician. You can, pursue them in multiple ways. It isn't my way or the highway with you as a provider. Those are modeling processes if the client internalizes that will be good for them going forward. And it's the same thing that happened when you had a good model around you from a coach or a teacher or a sibling or a parent. So a lot of what we're doing, I think, is modeling positive processes in a good, powerful working alliance. And when you know that, you can avoid, fostering dependence and calling that a good relationship. And you can harness the power of the relationship even better.
We have a couple more questions and only a couple minutes to get to them. So let's try going through them as quickly as I'll try to read them as quickly as I can. The process-based assessment approach seems to rely heavily on our assessment of the essential processes of change. In considering more idiographic research projects, what are your recommendations for selecting/optimizing the ideal processes of interest?
Well, I think and this new tool app is going to allow you to do is take the items that seem to really focus on a contextualized action, something you can do something about, that work inside our nomothetically derived measures of processes and so forth, the ones that you care about in the particular field you're in or approach you take, and then measure them in a high density way, but include context. Are you drinking? Were you with people? Whatever you think is important. Include outcome. What's going on in terms of social relationships or sadness or whatever. And then the tools that are coming will allow you to get back answers that are idiographic. So we're going to have to answer that through some trial and error and some good theory. But I think the EAM gives you a place to start. If you have processes that promote healthy variation and selection of what works, being able to retain it and fit it to context. If your item passes that kind of test and your model passes it, you're more likely to succeed, in my opinion.
Got time for another?
Yeah.
Let's try. How would you define evidence-based? What phenomena constitute adequate evidence?
It's a really good question. And I think in a process-based therapy model, it's evidence that you're able to, in your model, specify the processes of change that are important, measure them, target them, and show that when you do, the client's goals are fostered. So being able to alter the biopsychosocial processes that lead to the client outcomes that we're being hired to help produce is, I think, what evidence-based therapy is. And so you need scientific evidence that the the model, the kernels, and the processes work in accomplishing the client's goals. And that should not include just ones out of the DSM. And we've shown that the processes we're talking about actually do predict things like relationships that work, or being able to, be a good worker, or run a business, or creativity, or success at the Olympics. I mean, it really is, I think we have a chance to bust down the glass doors to the clinic and start serving people. And in the years of COVID, you look at it and you realize, don't just put everybody into a thing saying, oh, you're depressed, no, it's that people need support in creating a life worth living. And, and we've all been stretched over the last 2 years, but that doesn't mean we all have a DSM disorder. Don't do that. Instead, we all need healthy psychological processes that will allow us to engage with people, and to diet, sleep, and exercise gets oriented, and to be able to create and work. And, Freud's big three, it works just fine. Work, relationships, and play would work just fine, that allow us. So yeah, that's the game. And I think that means we will have a much broader impact on the culture, and a much broader interest from the culture, since we're not just correcting these latent diseases that we never find. We're empowering the human beings we're working with.
Last one, and I just neglected to ask this one before, but so sorry, Peter, but is a machine capable of empathy?
No, and yet, you really have to be impressed with what's happening with apps and websites and things of that kind. And it does make, the human relationship is really, really important. But I don't think we should forget that we have a vast amount of data showing that these other ways into human lives also are important. So we, as behavior change specialists, need to be part of how best to use science and technology. For example, in the virtual world, I think there absolutely are going to be therapists that will be virtual therapists. And I'm not sure if that's horrible when we look at all the number of people who need help, and the number of therapists are out there. If I could take just 30 seconds more. Vikram Patel has a really cool project underway to create empowerment workers around the United States, not a new semi-profession, but just getting to your neighbor, to your church group leader, or whatever, with the best psychological knowledge we have, to be able to be there for each other when we're suffering, when we need help. That's been the human culture. And we can be ones who help put that in there. So yeah, empathy properly done is definitely part of it. But let's all tools, all people, and for all people, because we don't want to be in a place where only the people who can pay the fees get the care, and only when we can put them into 5 out of 9 cubby hole. That's just not what we came to do as professionals, I believe.
And with that, we are out of time. So I want to thank you all for your attendance and attention, and a special thanks to you, Dr. Hayes, for coming to speak with us today. It's a very thought-provoking talk, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the attention.
Thanks, everybody. All right, bye-bye.